managing access to APIs. We also have the ability to use the API manager to manage access to APIs. From here, we can define SLA tiers and apply runtime policies. The API gateway will allow us to enforce these policies. So think about the ability to have a proxy set up where we could dynamically inject different policies to ensure that our API gateway or proxy has effective governance for our use case. To do this, inside of API Manager, there's a Policies tab in the bottom. And that Policies tab will allow us to add or remove any policies based on what our proxy scenario requires. There's a lot of out-of-the-box runtime policies from some of the very common use cases. Things like rate limiting, throttling, and doing security like client ID, client secret, OAuth 2, basic auth, hooking into ping federate, OpenAM, LDAP, IP whitelisting, and blacklisting. You can also define your own custom policies. Effectively, you can build out some XML that defines what the custom policy should do. You can add that custom policy to the platform and reuse it throughout your different API proxies. And you can have multiple policies throughout. And as long as you've got a later version of API Gateway or MMUULLEE 3.8.0, you're going to be able to specify or set the order of those API policies. Also, you can create SLAs to go with these policies. A service level agreement tier defines the number of requests that can be made per time frame on the API. The SLA tier request approval can be set to automatic or manual. Usually you'll see automatic for some of the free tiers. If I'm a developer and I go out requesting access and I should instantly get 5 requests a minute, then I can have that set as my automatic tier. Whereas the manual tier would oftentimes be ones you're either monetizing or maybe just require a more manual access grant because it's more important to sift through who is requesting access to this API or this tier. You can use API Manager just like for policies to define SLA tiers by going to the SLA tier tab. To enforce SLA tiers, you can apply SLA-based rate limiting or throttling. SLA-based policies require all applications that consume the API to register for access. You may have seen this with other APIs where you have to go and define your application and request access for a token or some type of specifier for your app, and then pass your client credentials in when you make calls to that API. To request access to SLA tiers, if you have SLA-based policies applied to your API, you're going to see a request access button in the top right of your API portal. To request access, the developer must belong to the Anypoint Platform organization and be logged in. When a developer requests access, they must register and add an app to the Anypoint Platform account. This will require them specifying an app name with some optional parameters like description, URL, and OAuth URI, and select the tier in which they'd like to request access for. For tiers that are going to have manual approval, those who are administering this API are going to be provided with an email saying that there were developers requesting access. They can then go in and review those API requests and determine whether they want to approve, reject, or if there's a pre-existing one they've approved or reject, actually revoke access to an existing allowance that's been made to a specific request. So let's try to put all this together in our own API. Walk through 4.4, restrict API access. We'll add and test a rate limiting policy. We will add SLA tiers, one with a manual approval. We'll add a rate limiting SLA-based policy and see the impact. Request access for an app to an SLA tier from the developer portal. Approve access for an application to an SLA tier. And then call the governed API with our new client credentials. Let's get started. Let's start off by going back to the American Flights API, version 1.0. Inside of our American Flights API, we'll go down to the application section. Here we can see there's currently no applications registered. Let's click over to the policies tab and view some of the available policies that we can put inside of our API proxy layer. In this case, let's start with a rate limiting policy and see what impact it has. For rate limiting, we will select apply. And then let's set the number of requests to 3, and let's set the time frame to minute, and hit apply. So now that we're rate limiting 3 requests per minute, let's try to make more than 3 requests a minute to our API and see what ends up happening. So let's return to Postman. And from Postman, if you have the same request, just be sure you're going through the API proxy and not the implementation layer. Let's send 3 requests in. And on the 4th request, we should actually get a response back, where we get a 429 response code, too many requests, and a message coming back to our client stating API calls exceeded. So just like that, we've dynamically enforced some type of governance inside of our API. Now, let's imagine this in the SLA standpoint. What if we want various levels of this rate limiting? Well, let's return to the platform. And inside of the platform, we will click our SLA tier tab. From the SLA tier tab, let's add an SLA tier. Let's call this first SLA tier the free tier. The approval type for free is going to be automatic. And we're going to give the free tier 1 request per hour. Once you've got this in place, go ahead and add this SLA tier. Now let's create a second SLA tier. This is going to be the silver tier, and it's going to have a lot more as far as requests. So we'll do number of requests 1, and in this case, we'll allow for 1 request per second. We'll ensure that the silver tier is manual so that we have to approve those particular requests. And let's hit add. Now, just by putting these SLA tiers in place doesn't actually mean that they are being enforced. If we go back to the Policies tab, we'll notice that we still have just the rate limiting policy in place. We're not using the rate limiting SLA-based policy. To set this up, let's go ahead and remove our rate limiting policy. And let's apply the rate limiting SLA-based policy instead. We'll be prompted with a dialog effectively telling us that it's going to now need to reference a client ID and secret. This way it can ensure that our client has either the free tier or the silver tier. By default, it's going to use a MMUULLEE expression to look in a query parameter for client ID and secret. If you ever wanted to change this to look in the headers or an alternative location, that would be possible. For now, query parameters will work just fine. Let's hit apply. Now, let's go back to Postman and see what happens when we try to make this request again. So it's definitely been over a minute since the API calls are exceeded. Let's see if my request goes through. If you hit send again, this time it should fail as well, and you should get a slightly different message. The status in this case should be a 401, stating that it's effectively not able to identify you. You're unable to retrieve the client ID of the message. So now that we're using SLAs, we need to provide client ID and secret details to ensure that our client can go against what our rate limiting tier is. Let's see if we can set this up now. So we'll return to Anypoint Platform, and let's look inside of the API details page for the Flights API in Anypoint Platform. Within the API portal area, we'll click the View Live Portal button. And this will load up the API portal we'd set up in an earlier module. You'll notice in the top right there's the green Request API Access button. Let's click that. And then it will ask us which application would like access. In this case, we likely don't have an application, so let's create a new one. So this application will give a name. In this case, I'll call it AP Dev, fictitious application. All right. And you're welcome to put in a description and URL if you'd like to put in some fake pieces here, but all we need is the name, and we can hit add. And once we've added that application, we can go to the SLA tier and say whether we want to request the free access or the silver access. In this case, let's request the silver access for 1 request a second and click Request API Access. All right, now it's saying your request has been received and is pending approval. Great. Now, let's go ahead and hit OK. And we'll back up to the developer portal following the breadcrumbs up here. From developer portal, not only can we see a list of all the APIs, but an area we haven't looked at is a list of the applications. So if we click on My Applications, we can see that my user owns this APDev fictitious application. If we click on that link, we can get details about the application. We can see that I am pending a request for the silver tier. And I can also see the client ID and secret that I will be using in this application. So let's take a moment and copy this client ID and client secret and paste it into our student files, as we're going to need it a bit later in order to make requests. So inside of our student files, in the student snippets text file, in module 3, we're just going to paste these credentials in for use a little bit later. So inside, I'm going to paste in my client ID. And then underneath that, client secret, just so I can come back and reference it easily. All right, and just clean this up for consistency here. Great. So now the client ID and client secret is persisted inside of the snippets file. This way we can come back and check it out a little bit later. Now, let's see if we can approve this request so we can make some of these different requests through Postman. If we go back to the Anypoint platform where our API is being managed and click the Applications tab or refresh the page again, we should now see under that Applications tab that there is a pending request for the APDev fictitious application. So let's go ahead and approve our request. That way we have access. Now in Postman, we should be able to make requests assuming we provide the client ID and secret. Let's see if we can set this up. Going back to Postman, you'll see inside of Postman that we have the ability to put in some different parameters here. Just like any REST request, we can add query parameters. So in this case, I'm going to back it off, make sure it's just flights in this case to keep it nice and clean. And inside of Postman, we actually have a feature called params we can click on and add in these parameters in a graphical way. So let's start off by specifying client ID, and you'll see how it's building that out. Now, be careful here. It needs to be exactly as it was in the platform. So it's going to be client_ID. And then from our student files, we can go ahead and copy that client ID and paste it into Postman. And we're going to do a similar setup for client secret. So we'll type it in just as it was in the platform. We'll go to our client secret and we will copy that and paste that into the value box. So now we've got our client ID and our client secret. With this in place, let's go ahead and hit send. Great. And now we're actually getting response data back, authenticating ourselves as a valid client. If we make a subtle mistake here, like change the E in my case to a D and hit send, you'll notice we're instantly rejected with an invalid client ID. If we switch it back to E, we can see that we can send the request in once again and get a response. And if we go to headers, we can even see some details around rate limiting. So our client has details about what the current rate limiting policy is, how many more requests it can make. So just like that, we've dynamically enforced SLA tiers and are ensuring there's a level of governance on top of our flight API implementation.